Hello everyone, welcome to our channel Reading by Me. In this video, we'll be reading the second chapter of History of Modern India by Bipin Chandra, Indian States and Society in the 18th Century. Indian States and Society in the 18th Century. Decay of the Mughal Empire. With the gradual weakening and decline of the Mughal Empire, local and regional political and economic forces began to arise and assert themselves, and politics began to undergo major changes from the late 17th century onwards. During the 18th century, on the debris of the Mughal Empire and its political system, rose a large number of independent and semi independent powers such as the Bengal, Awadh, Hyderabad, Mysore, and Maratha kingdoms. It is these powers which the British had to overcome in their attempt at supremacy in India. Some of these states, such as Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad, may be characterized as succession states. They arose as a result of the assertion of autonomy by governors of Mughal provinces with the decay of the central power. Others, such as the Maratha, Afghan, Jet, and Punjab states, were the product of rebellions by local chieftains, zamindars, and peasants against Mughal authority. Not only did the politics in the two types of the states or zones differed to some extent from each other, but there were differences among all of them because of the local conditions. Yet, not surprisingly, the overall political and administrative framework was very similar in nearly all of them. There was, of course, also a third zone comprising of areas on the southwest and southeast coast and of northeastern India where Mughal influence had not penetrated to any degree. The rulers of all the 18th century states tried to legitimize their position by acknowledging the nominal supremacy of the Mughal emperor and by seeking his approval as his representatives. Moreover, nearly all of them adopted the methods and spirit of Mughal administration. The first group of states, succession states, inherited functioning Mughal administrative structures and institutions. Others tried to adopt and adapt in varying degrees this structure and institutions, including the Mughal revenue system. The rulers of these states established law and order and viable economic and administrative structures. They curbed with varying degrees of success the lower local officials and petty chiefs and zamindars who constantly fought with higher authorities for control over the surplus produce of the peasant and who sometimes succeeded in establishing local centers of power and patronage. They also conciliated and accommodated these local chiefs and zamindars who desired peace and law and order. In general, there was in most of the states decentralization of political authority with chiefs, jagirdars, and zamindars gaining in economic and political power. The politics of these states were invariably non communal or secular, the motivations of their rulers being similar in economic and political terms. These rulers did not discriminate on religious grounds in public appointments, civil or military, nor did the rebels against their authority pay much attention to the religion of the rulers. There is therefore little warrant for the belief that the decline and breakup of the Mughal Empire was followed by anarchy or breakdown of law and order in different parts of India. In fact, whatever anarchy in administration and economy existed in the 18th century usually followed British wars of conquest and British intervention in the internal affairs of Indian states. None of these states, however, succeeded in arresting the economic crisis which had set in during the 17th century. All of them remained basically rent extracting states. The zamindars and jagirdars, whose number and political strength constantly increased, continued to fight over the income from agriculture while the condition of the peasantry continued to deteriorate. While these states prevented any breakdown of internal trade and even tried to promote foreign trade, They did nothing to modernize the basic industrial and commercial structure of their states. This largely explains their failure to consolidate themselves or to ward off external attack. Hyderabad and the Carnatic. The state of Hyderabad was founded by Nizam ul Mulk Asaf Jah in 1724. He was one of the leading nobles of the post Aurangzeb era. He played a leading role in the overthrow of the Syed brothers and was rewarded with the viceroyalty of the Deccan. From 1720 to 1722, he consolidated his hold over the Deccan by suppressing all opposition to his viceroyalty and organizing the administration on efficient lines. From 1722 to 1724, he was the Wazir of the empire, but he soon got disgusted with that office as the Emperor Muhammad Shah frustrated all his attempts at reforming the administration. So he decided to go back to the Deccan where he could safely maintain his supremacy. Here, he laid the foundations of the Hyderabad state, which he ruled with a strong hand. He never openly declared his independence from the central government, but in practice, he acted like an independent ruler. He waged wars, concluded peace, conferred titles, and gave jagirs and offices without reference to Delhi. He followed a tolerant policy towards the Hindus. For example, a Hindu Puran Chand was his divan. He consolidated his power by establishing an orderly administration in the Deccan on the basis of the Jagirdari system on the Mughal pattern. He forced the big, turbulent zamindars to respect his authority and kept the powerful Marathas out of his dominions. He also made an attempt to rid the revenue system of its corruption, but after his death in 1748, Hyderabad fell a prey to the same disruptive forces as were operating at Delhi. The Carnatic was one of the Subah of the Mughal Deccan and as such came under the Nizam of Hyderabad's authority. But just as in practice, the Nizam had become independent of Delhi, so also the deputy governor of the Carnatic, known as the Nawab of Carnatic, had freed himself of the control of the viceroy of the Deccan and made his office hereditary. Thus, Nawab Sadutullah Khan of Carnatic had made his nephew Dost Ali his successor without the approval of his superior, the Nizam. Later, after 1740, the affairs of the Carnatic deteriorated because of the repeated struggles for its Nawabship, and this provided an opportunity to the European trading companies to directly interfere in Indian politics. Bengal, taking advantage of the growing weakness of the central authority, two men of exceptional ability, Murshid Quli Khan and Ali Vardi Khan, made Bengal virtually independent. Even though Murshid Quli Khan was made governor of Bengal as late as 1717, he had been its effective ruler since 1700, when he was appointed its Diwan. He soon freed himself from central control, though he regularly sent a large tribute to the emperor. He established peace by freeing Bengal of internal and external danger. Bengal was now also relatively free of major uprisings by zamindars. The only three major uprisings during his rule were first by Sitaram Ray, Uday Narayan, and Ghulam Muhammad, and then by Sujit Khan and finally by Najat Khan. After defeating them, Murshid Quli Khan gave their zamindaris to his favorite Ram Jivan. Murshid Quli Khan died in 1727 and his son-in-law Shujauddin ruled Bengal till 1739. In that year, Ali Vardi Khan deposed and killed Shujauddin's sons, Sarfaraz Khan, and made himself the Nawab. These three Nawabs gave Bengal a long period of peace and orderly administration and promoted its trade and industry. Murshid Quli Khan affected economics in the administration and reorganized the finances of Bengal by transferring large parts of Jagir lands into Khalisah lands by carrying out a fresh revenue settlement and by introducing the system of revenue farming. He recruited revenue farmers and officials from local zamindars and merchant bankers. He also granted agricultural loans to the poor cultivators to relieve their distress as well as to enable them to pay land revenue in time. He was thus able to increase the resources of the Bengal government. But the system of revenue farming led to increased economic pressure on the zamindars and peasants. Moreover, even though he demanded only the standard revenue and forbade illegal seizures, he collected the revenue from the zamindars and the peasants with utmost cruelty. Another result of his reforms was that many of the older zamindars were driven out and their place was taken by upstart revenue farmers. Murshid Quli Khan and the succeeding Nawabs gave equal opportunities for employment to Hindus and Muslims. They filled the highest civil posts and many of the military posts with Bengalis, mostly Hindus. In choosing revenue farmers, Murshid Quli Khan gave preference to local zamindars and mahajans who were mainly Hindus. He thus laid the foundation of a new landed aristocracy in Bengal. All the three Nawabs recognized that the expansion of trade benefited the people and the government and therefore gave encouragement to all merchants, Indian and foreign. They provided for the safety of roads and rivers from thieves and robbers by establishing regular tanas and chowkis. They checked private trade by officials. They prevented abuses in the customs administration. At the same time, they made it a point to maintain strict control over the foreign trading companies and their servants and prevented them from abusing their privileges. They compelled the servants of the English East India Company to obey the laws of the land and to pay the same custom duties as were being paid by other merchants. Alivardi Khan did not permit the English and the French to fortify their factories in Calcutta and Chandernagore. The Bengal Nawabs proved, however, to be short sighted and negligent in one respect. They did not firmly put down the increasing tendency of the English East India Company after 1707 to use military force or to threaten its use to get its demands accepted. They had the power to deal with the company's threats, but they continued to believe that a mere trading company could not threaten their power. They failed to see that the English company was no mere company of traders, but was the representative of the most aggressive and expansionist colonialism of the time. Their ignorance of and lack of contact with the rest of the world was to cause the state dear. Otherwise, they would have known of the devastation caused by the Western trading companies in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The Nawabs of Bengal neglected to build a strong army and paid a heavy price for it. For example, the army of Murshid Quli Khan consisted of only 2,000 cavalry and 4,000 infantry. Alivardi Khan was constantly troubled by the repeated invasions of the Marathas, and in the end, he had to cede a large part of Orissa to them. And when in 1756 to 67 the English East India Company declared war on Siraj ud Dowlah, the success of Alivardi, the absence of strong army contributed much to the viceroy of the foreigner. The Bengal Nawabs also failed to check the growing corruption among their officials. Even judicial officials, the qazis and muftis, were given to taking bribes. The foreign companies took full advantage of this weakness to undermine official rules and regulations and policies. Awadh, the founder of the autonomous kingdom of Awadh, was Saadat Khan Burhan ul Mulk, who was appointed governor of Awadh in 1722. He was an extremely bold, energetic, iron willed, and intelligent person. At the time of his appointment, many rebellious zamindars had raised their heads everywhere in the province. They refused to pay the land tax, organized their own private armies, erected forts, and defied the imperial government. For years, Sadat Khan had to wage war upon them. He succeeded in suppressing lawlessness and disciplining the big zamindars and thus increasing the financial resources of his government. He won over the chieftains and zamindars through various concessions. Moreover, most of the defeated zamindars were also not displaced. They were usually confirmed in their estates after they had submitted and agreed to pay their dues regularly. Sadat Khan also carried out a fresh revenue settlement in 1723. He is said to have improved the lot of the peasant by levying equitable land revenue and by protecting him from oppression by the big zamindars. Like the Bengal Nawabs, he too did not discriminate between Hindus and Muslims. Many of his commanders and high officials were Hindus, and he curbed refractory zamindars, chiefs, and nobles irrespective of their religion. His troops were well paid, well armed, and well trained. His administration was efficient. He too continued the Jagar system. Before his death in 1739, he had become virtually independent and had made the province a hereditary possession. He was succeeded by his nephew Safdar Jung, who was simultaneously appointed the Wazir of the Empire in 1748 and granted in addition the province of Allahabad. Safdar Jung gave a long period of peace to the people of Awadh and Allahabad before his death in 1754. He suppressed rebellious zamindars, won over others, and made an alliance with the Maratha. Here is the economic map of India during the first half of the 18th century. Sardar saw that his dominion was saved from their incursions. He was able to win the loyalty of Rajput chieftains and Sheikhzadas. He carried on warfare against the Rohilas and the Bangash Pathans. In his war against the Bangash Pathans in 1750-51, he secured Maratha military help by paying a daily allowance of rupees 25,000 and Jat support by paying rupees 15,000 a day. Later, he entered into an agreement with the Peshwa by which the Peshwa was to help the Mughal Empire against Ahmad Shah Abdali and to protect it from such internal rebels as the Indian Pathans and the Rajput Rajas. In return, the Peshwa was to be paid rupees 50 lakhs, granted the Chowth of the Punjab, Sindh, and several districts of northern India, and made the governor of Ajmer and Agra. The agreement failed, however, as the Peshwa went over to Safdar Jung's enemies at Delhi, who promised himself the governorship of Awadh and Allahabad. Safdar Jung also organized an equitable system of justice. He too adopted a policy of impartiality in the employment of Hindus and Muslims. The highest post in his government was held by a Hindu, Maharaja Nawab Rai. The prolonged period of peace and of economic prosperity of the nobles under the government of Nawabs resulted in time in the growth of a distinct Lucknow culture around the Awadh court. Lucknow, for long an important city of Awadh and the seat of the Awadh Nawabs after 1775, soon rivaled of Delhi in its patronage of the arts and literature. It also developed as an important center of handicrafts. Crafts and culture also percolated to towns under the patronage of local chieftains and zamindars. Safdar Jung maintained a very high standard of personal morality. All his life, he was devoted to his only wife. As a matter of fact, all the founders of the three autonomous kingdoms of Hyderabad, Bengal, and Awadh, namely Nizam ul Mulk, Murshid Quli Khan, and Alivardi Khan, and Sadat Khan, and Safdar Jung, were men of high personal morality. Nearly all of them led austere and simple lives. Their lives give lie to the belief that all the leading nobles of the 18th century led extravagant and luxurious life. It was only in their public and political dealings that they resorted to fraud, intrigue, and treachery. Mysore. Next to Hyderabad, the most important power that emerged in South India was Mysore under Hyder Ali. The kingdom of Mysore had preserved its precarious independence ever since the end of the Vijayanagar Empire and had been only nominally a part of the Mughal Empire. Early in the 18th century, two ministers, Nanja Raj, the Sarvadhikari, and Dev Raj, the Dulwai, had seized power in Mysore, reducing the king Chikka Krishna Raj to a mere puppet. Hyder Ali, born in 1721 in an obscure family, started his career as a petty officer in the Mysore army. Though uneducated, he possessed a keen intellect and was a man of great energy, daring, and determination. He was also a brilliant commander and a shrewd diplomat. Hyder Ali soon found his opportunity in the wars which involved Mysore for more than 20 years. Cleverly using the opportunities that came his way, he gradually rose in the Mysore army. He soon recognized the advantages of Western military training and applied it to the troops under his own command. He established a modern arsenal in Dindigal in 1755 with the help of French experts. In 1761, he overthrew Nanja Raj and established his authority over the Mysore state. He extended full control over the rebellious polygars and conquered the territories of Bidnur, Sunda, Sera, Kanara, and Malabar. A major reason for his occupation of Malabar was a desire to have access to the Indian Ocean. Though illiterate, he was an efficient administrator. He was responsible for introducing the Mughal administrative and revenue system in his dominions. He took over Mysore when it was a weak and divided state and soon made it one of the leading Indian powers. He practiced religious tolerance, and his first Diwan and many other officials were Hindus. Almost from the beginning of the establishment of his power, he was engaged in wars with the Maratha Sardars, the Nizam, and the British. In 1769, he repeatedly defeated the British forces and reached the walls of Madras. He died in 1782 in the course of the Second Anglo Mysore War and was succeeded by his son Tipu. Sultan Tipu, who ruled Mysore till his death at the hands of the British in 1799, was a man of complex character. He was, for one, an innovator. His desire to change with the times was symbolized in the introduction of a new calendar, a new system of coinage, and new scales of weights and measures. His personal library contained books on such diverse subjects as religion, history, military science, medicine, and mathematics. He showed a keen interest in the French Revolution. He planted a tree of liberty at Srirangapatnam and he became a member of a Jacobean club. His organizational capacity is borne out by the fact that in those days of general indiscipline among Indian armies, his troops remained disciplined and loyal to him to the last. He tried to do away with the custom of giving jagirs and thus increase state income. He also made an attempt to reduce the hereditary possessions of the polygars and to eliminate the intermediaries between the state and the cultivator. However, his land revenue was as high as that of other contemporary rulers. It ranged up to one third of the gross produce, but he checked the collection of illegal cesses and he was liberal in granting remissions. His infantry was armed with muskets and bayonets in the European fashion, which were, however, manufactured in Mysore. He also made an effort to build a modern navy after 1796. For this purpose, he established two dockyards, the models of the ships being supplied by the Sultan himself. In personal life, he was free from vices and kept himself free from luxury. He was recklessly brave and, as a commander, brilliant. He was fond of saying that it was better to live a day as a lion than a lifetime as a sheep. He died fighting at the gates of Srirangapatnam in pursuance of this belief. He was, however, hasty in action and unstable in nature. As a statesman, he, moreover than any other 18th century Indian ruler, recognized to the full extent the threat that the English posed to South India as well as to other Indian powers. He stood forth as the steadfast foe of the rising English power. The English, in turn, looked upon him as their most dangerous enemy in India. Though not free from contemporary economic backwardness, Mysore flourished economically under Hyder Ali and Tipu, especially when seen in contrast with its immediate past or with the rest of the country. When the British occupied Mysore after defeating and killing Tipu in 1799, they were surprised to find that the Mysore peasant was much more prosperous than the peasant in British occupied Madras. Sir John Shore, Governor General from 1793 to 1798, wrote later that the peasantry of his dominions are protected and their labor encouraged and rewarded. Another British observer wrote of Tipu's Mysore as well cultivated populace with industrious inhabitants, cities newly founded, and commerce extending. Tipu also seems to have grasped the importance of modern trade and industry. In fact, alone among the Indian rulers, he understood the importance of economic strength as the foundation of military strength. He made some attempts to introduce modern industries in India by importing foreign workmen as experts and by extending state support to many industries. He sent emissaries to France, Turkey, Iran, and Pegu, Myanmar to develop foreign trade. He also traded with China. He even tried to set up a trading company on the pattern of European companies and thus sought to imitate their commercial practices. He tried to promote trade with Russia and Arabia by setting up state trading in the institutions in the port towns. Some British historians have described Tipu as a religious fanatic, but this is not borne out by facts. Though he was orthodox in his religious views, he was in fact tolerant and enlightened in his approach towards other religions. He gave money for the construction of the image of goddess Sarda in the Sringeri temple after the later was looted by Maratha horsemen in 1791. He regularly gave gifts to this temple as well as several other temples. The famous temple of Sri Ranganath was situated barely 100 yards from his palace. But while he treated the vast majority of his Hindu and Christian subjects with consideration and tolerance, he was harsh on those Hindus and Christians who might directly or indirectly aid the British against Mysore. Kerala. At the beginning of the 18th century, Kerala was divided up among a large number of feudal chiefs and rajas. The four most important states were those of Calicut under the Zamorin, Chirakkal, Cochin, and Travancore. The kingdom of Travancore rose into prominence after 1729 under King Martanda Varma, one of the leading statesmen of the 18th century. He combined rare foresight and strong determination with courage and daring. He subdued the feudatories, conquered Ceylon and Elayadam, and defeated the Dutch, thus ending their political power in Kerala. He organized a strong army on the Western model with the help of European officers and armed it with the modern weapons. He also constructed a modern arsenal. Martanda Varma used his new army to expand northwards, and the boundaries of Travancore soon extended from Kanyakumari to Cochin. He undertook many irrigation works, built roads and canals for communication, and gave active encouragement to foreign trade. By 1763, all the petty principalities of Kerala had been absorbed or subordinated by the three big states of Cochin, Travancore, and Calicut. Hyder Ali began his invasion of Kerala in 1766 and in the end annexed northern Kerala up to Cochin, including the territories of Zamorin of Calicut. The 18th century saw a remarkable revival in Malayalam literature. This was due in part to the Rajas and chiefs of Kerala, who was great patrons of literature. Trivandrum, the capital of Travancore, became, in the second half of the 18th century, a famous center of Sanskrit scholarship. Ramavarma successor of Martanda Varma, was himself a poet, scholar, musician, renowned actor, and a man of great culture. He conversed fluently in English, took a keen interest in European affairs, and regularly read newspapers and journals published in London, Calcutta, and Madras, areas around Delhi, the Rajput states. The principal Rajput states took advantage of the growing weakness of the Mughal power to virtually free themselves from central control while at the same time increasing their influence in the rest of the empire. In the reigns of Farooq Siyar and Muhammad Shah, the rulers of Amber and Marwar were appointed governors of important Mughal provinces such as Agra, Gujarat, and Malwa. The Rajputana states continued to be as divided as before. The bigger among them expanded at the cost of their weaker neighbors, Rajput and non Rajput. Most of the larger Rajput states were constantly involved in petty quarrels and civil wars. The internal politics of these states were often characterized by the same type of corruption, intrigue, and treachery as prevailed at the Mughal court. Thus, Ajit Singh of Marwar was killed by his own son. The most outstanding Rajput ruler of the 18th century was Raja Savai Jai Singh of Amber from 1681 to 1743. He was a distinguished statesman, lawmaker, and reformer, but most of all, he shone as a man of science in an age when Indians were oblivious of scientific progress. He founded the city of Jaipur and made it a great seat of science and art. Jaipur was built upon strictly scientific principles and according to a regular plan. Its board streets are intersected at right angles. Jai Singh was above everything a great astronomer. He erected observatories with accurate and advanced instruments, some of them of his own invention, at Delhi, Jaipur, Ujjain, Varanasi, and Mathura. His astronomical observations were remarkably accurate. He drew up a set of tables entitled Zij Muhammad Shahi to enable people to make astronomical observations. He had Euclid's Elements of Geometry translated into Sanskrit, as also several works on trigonometry and Napier's work on the construction and use of logarithms. Jai Singh was also a social reformer. He tried to enforce a law to reduce the lavish expenditure which the Rajputs had to incur on their daughter's wedding. This had given rise to the evil practice of female infanticide. This remarkable prince ruled Jaipur for nearly 44 years from 1699 to 1743. The Jats. The Jats, a caste of agriculturalists, lived in the region around Delhi, Agra, and Mathura. Jat peasants around Mathura revolted under the leadership of their Jat zamindars in 1669 and then again in 1688. These revolts were crushed, but the area remained disturbed. After the death of Aurangzeb, they created disturbances all around Delhi. Though originally a peasant uprising, the Jat revolt, led by zamindars, soon became predatory. They took active part in the court intrigues at Delhi, often changing sides to suit their own advantage. The Jet state of Bharatpur was set up by Churaman and Badan Singh. Jet power reached its highest glory under Suraj Mal, who ruled from 1756 to 1763 and who was an extremely able administrator and soldier and a very wise statesman. He extended his authority over a large area which extended from the Ganga in the east to the Chambal in the south, the Subah of Agra in the west to the Subah of Delhi in the north. His state included, among others, the districts of Agra, Mathura, Meerut, and Aligarh. He tried to lay the foundations of an enduring state by adopting the Mughal revenue system. A contemporary historian has described him as follows. Though he wore the dress of a farmer and could speak only his own Braj dialect, he was the plateau of the Jet tribe. In prudence, and skill and ability to manage the revenue and civil affairs, he had no equal among the grandees of Hindustan except Asaf Jah Bahadur. After his death in 1763, the Jet state declined and was split up among petty zamindars, most of whom lived by plunder. Bangashpatan and Rohelas. Muhammad Khan Bangash, an Afghan adventurer, established his control over the territory around Farrukhabad between what are now Aligarh and Kanpur during the reigns of Farooq Siyar and Muhammad Shah. Similarly, during the breakdown of administration following Nadir Shah's invasion, Ali Muhammad Khan carved out a separate principality known as Rohilkhand at the foothills of the Himalayas between the Ganga in the south and the Kumaon hills in the north, with its capital at first at Alan in Bareilly and later at Rampur. The Rohillas clashed constantly with Awadh, Delhi, and the Jats. The Sikhs, founded at the end of the 15th century by Guru Nanak, the Sikh religion spread among the Jat peasantry and other lower castes of the Punjab. The transformation of the Sikhs into a militant, fighting community was begun by Guru Har Gobind 1606 to 45. It was, however, under the leadership of Guru Gobind Singh from 1666 to 1708, the 10th and the last Guru of the Sikhs, that they became a political and military force. From 1699 onwards, Guru Gobind Singh waged constant war against the armies of Aurangzeb and the Hill Rajas. After Guru Gobind Singh's death, the institution of Guruship came to an end and the leadership of Sikhs passed to his trusted disciple Banda Singh Bahadur. Banda Singh Bahadur rallied together the peasants and the lower caste of the Punjab from Delhi to Lahore and carried on a vigorous, though unequal, struggle against the Mughal army for 8 years. He was captured in 1715 and put to death. There were several reasons for his failure. The Mughal centre was still strong. The upper classes and castes of Punjab joined forces against Banda Singh Bahadur for his championship of the lower castes and rural poor. The invasions of Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali and the consequent dislocation of Punjab administration gave the Sikhs an opportunity to rise once again. They soon began to fill the political vacuum. Between 1765 and 1800, they brought the Punjab and Jammu under their control. The Sikhs were organized into 12 misls or confederacies which operated in different parts of the province. These missiles fully cooperated with one another. They were originally based on the principle of equality, with all members having an equal voice in deciding the affairs of a missile and in electing its chief and other officers. Gradually, the democratic and plebeian character of the missiles disappeared and powerful feudal chiefs and zamindars dominated them. The Punjab under Ranjit Singh. At the end of the 18th century, Ranjit Singh, chief of the Sukher Chakia missile, rose to prominence. A strong and courageous soldier, an efficient administrator, and a skillful diplomat, he was a born leader of men. He captured Lahore in 1799 and Amritsar in 1802. He soon brought all Sikh chiefs west of the Satluj under his control and established his own kingdom in the Punjab. Later, he conquered Kashmir, Peshawar, and Multan. The old Sikh chiefs were transformed into big zamindars and jagirdars. He did not make any changes in the system of land revenue promulgated earlier by the Mughals. The amount of land revenue was calculated on the basis of 50% of the gross produce. Ranjit Singh built up a powerful, disciplined, and well equipped army along European lines with the help of European instructors. His new army was not confined to the Sikhs. He also recruited Gurkhas, Biharis, Oriyas, Pathans, Dogras, and Punjabi Muslims. He set up modern foundries to manufacture cannon at Lahore and employed Muslim gunners to man them. It is said that he possessed the second best army in Asia, the first being the army of English East Indian Company. Ranjit Singh had great capacity for choosing his ministers and officials. His court was studded with outstanding men. He was tolerant and liberal in religious matters. He patronized not only Sikh but also Muslim and Hindu holy men. Many of his important ministers and commanders were Muslims and Hindus. The most prominent and trusted of his ministers was Farik Azizuddin, while his finance minister was Devan Dinanath. His was a state based on equal opportunities for all. Political power was not used for exclusive Sikh benefit. On the other hand, the Sikh peasant was much oppressed by Sikh chiefs as was the Hindu or Muslim peasant. In fact, the structure of the Punjab as a state under Ranjit Singh was similar to the structure of the other Indian states of the 18th century. When the British forbade Ranjit Singh in 1809 to cross the Satluj and took the six states east of the river under the under their protection, he kept quiet, for he realized that his strength was no match for the British. Thus, by his diplomatic realism and military strength, he temporarily saved his kingdom from English encroachment. But he did not remove the foreign threat, he only left it for his successors. And so, after his death, when his kingdom was torn by an intense internal struggle for power, the English moved in and conquered it. The rise and fall of the Maratha power, the most important challenge to the decaying Mughal power, came from the Maratha kingdom, which was the most powerful of the succession states. In fact, it alone possessed the strength to fill the political vacuum created by the disintegration of the Mughal Empire. Moreover, it produced a number of brilliant commanders and statesmen needed for their task. But the Maratha Sardars lacked unity, and they lacked the outlook and program which were necessary for founding an all India empire, and so they failed to replace the Mughals. They did, however, succeed in waging continuous war against the Mughal Empire till they destroyed it. Shahu, the grandson of Shivaji, had been a prisoner in the hands of Aurangzeb since 1689. Aurangzeb had treated him and his mother with great dignity, honor, and consideration, paying full attention to their religious, caste, and other needs, hoping perhaps to arrive at a political agreement with Shahu. Shahu was released in 1707 after Aurangzeb's death. Very soon, a civil war broke out between Shahu at Satara and his aunt Tarabai at Kolhapur, who had carried out an anti Mughal struggle since 1700 in the name of her son Shivaji too, after the death of her husband Raja Ram. Maratha Sardars, each one of whom had a large following of soldiers loyal to himself alone, began to side with one or the other contender for power. They used this opportunity to increase their power and influence by bargaining with the two contenders for power. Several of them even intrigued with the Mughal viceroys of the Deccan. Arising from the conflict between Shahu and his rival at Kolhapur, a new system of Maratha government was evolved under the leadership of Balaji Vishwanath, the Peshwa of King Shahu. With this change began the second period, the period of Peshwa domination in Maratha history, in which the Maratha state was transformed into an empire. Balaji Vishwanath, a Brahmin, started life as a petty revenue official and then arose step by step. He rendered Shahu loyal and useful service in suppressing his enemies. He excelled in diplomacy and won over many of the big Maratha Sardars to Shahu's cause. In 1713, Shahu made him his Peshwa or the Mukh Pradhan, chief minister. Balaji Vishwanath gradually consolidated Shahu's hold and his own over Maratha Sardars and over most of the Maharashtra except for the region south of Kolhapur where Raja Ram's descendants ruled. The Peshwa concentrated power in his office and eclipsed the other ministers and Sardars. In fact, he and his son Baji Rao I made the Peshwa the functional head of the Maratha Empire. Balaji Vishwanath took full advantage of the internal conflicts of the Mughal officials to increase Maratha power. He had induced Zulfikar Khan to grant the Chowth and Sardesh Mukhi of the Deccan. In the end, he signed a pact with the Said brothers. All the territories that had earlier formed Shivaji's kingdom were restored to Shahu, who was also assigned the Chowth and Sardeshmukhi of the six provinces of the Deccan. In return, Shahu, who had already recognized, though nominally, Mughal suzerainty, agreed to place a body of 15,000 cavalry at the emperor's service to prevent rebellion and plundering in the Deccan and to pay an annual tribute of 10 lakhs of rupees. He also walked barefoot and paid obeisance at the tomb of Aurangzeb at Kuldabad in 1714. In 1719, Balaji Vishwanath, at the head of a Maratha force, accompanied Syed Hussain Ali Khan to Delhi and helped the Syed brothers in overthrowing Farrukh Siyar. At Delhi, he and the other Maratha Sardars witnessed at first hand the weakness of the empire and were filled with the ambition of expansion in the north. For the efficient collection of the Chowth and Sardeshmukhi of the Deccan, Balaji Vishwanath assigned separate areas to Maratha Sardars who kept the greater part of the collection for their expenses. This system of assignment of the Chowth and Sardeshmukhi also enabled the Peshwa to increase his personal power through patronage. An increasing number of ambitious Sardars began to flock round him. In the long run, this was to be a major source of weakness to the Maratha Empire. Already, the system of Vatans and Sarajans had made the Maratha Sardars strong, autonomous, and jealous of central power. They now began to establish their control in the distant lands of the Mughal Empire, where they gradually settled down as more or less autonomous chiefs. Thus, the conquest of the Marathas outside their original kingdom were not made by a central army directly controlled by the Maratha king or the Peshwa, but by Sardars with their own private armies. During the process of conquest, these Sardars often clashed with one another. If the central authority tried to control them too strictly, they did not hesitate to join hands with the enemies, be they the Nizam, the Mughals, or the English. Balaji Vishwanath died in 1720. He was succeeded as Peshwa by his 20-year-old son Baji Rao I. In spite of his youth, Baji Rao was a bold and brilliant commander and an ambitious, clever statesman. He has been described as the greatest exponent of guerrilla tactics after Shivaji. Led by Baji Rao, the Marathas waged numerous campaigns against the Mughal Empire, trying to compel the Mughal officials first to give them the right to collect the chowth of vast areas and then to cede these areas to the Maratha kingdom. By 1740, when Baji Rao died, the Marathas had won control over Malwa, Gujarat, and parts of Bundelkhand. The Maratha families of Gaikwad, Holkar, Sindhia, and Bhonsle came into prominence during this period. All his life, Baji Rao worked to contain Nizam ul Mulk's power in the Deccan. The latter, on his part, constantly intrigued with the Raja of Kolhapur, the Maratha Sardars, and Mughal officials to weaken the Peshwa's authority. Twice the two met on the field of battle, and both times the Nizam was worsted and was compelled to grant the Marathas the Chaud and Sardeshmukhi of the Deccan provinces. In 1733, Baji Rao started a long campaign against the Siddhis of Janjira and in the end expelled them from the mainland. Simultaneously, a campaign against the Portuguese was started. In the end, Salcete and Bessin were captured, but the Portuguese continued to hold their other possessions on the west coast. Baji Rao died in 1740. In the short period of 20 years, he had changed the character of the Maratha state. From the kingdom of Maharashtra, it had been transformed into an empire expanding in the north. He, however, failed to lay firm foundations of an empire. New territories were conquered and occupied, by little attention was paid to their administration. The chief concern of the successful Sardars was with the collection of revenues. Baji Rao's 18-year-old son Balaji Baji Rao was the Peshwa from 1740 to 1761. He was as able as his father, though less energetic. King Shah, who died in 1749, and by his will left the management of the state affairs in Peshwa's hands. The office of the Peshwa had already become hereditary, and the Peshwa was the de facto ruler of the state. Now he became the official head of the administration, and as a symbol of this fact, shifted the government to Pune, his headquarters. Balaji Baji Rao followed in the footsteps of his father and further extended the empire in different directions, taking Maratha power to its height. Maratha armies now overran the whole of India. Maratha control over Malwa, Gujarat, and Bundelkhand was consolidated. Bengal was repeatedly invaded, and in 1751 the Bengal Nawab had to cede Orissa. In the south, the state of Mysore and other minor principalities were forced to pay tribute. In 1760, the Nizam of Hyderabad was defeated at Udgir and compelled to cede vast territories yielding an annual revenue of rupees 62 lakh. In the north, the Marathas soon became the power behind the Mughal throne. Marching through the Gangetic Doab, the Rajputana, they reached Delhi, where in 1752 they helped Imad ul Mulk to become the Wazir. The new Wazir soon became a puppet in their hands. From Delhi, they turned to the Punjab and soon brought it under control after expelling the agent of Ahmad Shah Abdali. This brought them into conflict with the doughty warrior king of Afghanistan, who once again marched into India to settle accounts with the Maratha power. A major conflict for mastery over North India now began. Ahmad Shah Abdali soon formed an alliance with Najib-ud-Dawla of Rohilkhand and Shuja-ud-Dawla of Awadh, both of whom had suffered at the hands of the Maratha Sardars. Recognizing the great importance of the coming struggle, the Peshwa dispatched a powerful army to the north under the nominal command of his minor son, the actual command being in the hands of his cousin Sadashiv Rao Bahu. An important arm of this force was a contingent of European style infantry and artillery commanded by Ibrahim Khan Gardi. The Marathas now tried to find allies among the northern powers, but their earlier behavior and political ambitions have antagonized all these powers. They had interfered in the internal affairs of the Rajputana states and levied huge fines and tributes upon them. They had made large territorial and monetary claims upon Awadh. Their actions in the Punjab had angered the Sikh chiefs. Similarly, the Jat chiefs, on whom they had also imposed heavy fines, did not trust them. They had therefore to fight their enemies all alone. Except for the weak support of Imad ul Mulk, moreover, the senior Maratha commanders constantly bickered with one another. The two forces met at Panipat on 14 January 1761. The Maratha army was completely routed. The Peshwa's son, Vishwas Rao, Sadashiv Rao Bahu, and numerous other Maratha commanders perished on the battlefield, as did nearly 28,000 soldiers. Those who fled were pursued by the Afghan cavalry and robbed and plundered by the Jats, Ahirs, and Gujaras of the Panipat region. The Peshwa, who was marching north to help his cousin, was stunned by the tragic news. Already seriously ill, his end was hastened and he died in June 1761. The Maratha defeat at Panipat was a disaster for them. They lost the cream of their army and their political prestige suffered a big blow. Most of all, their defeat gave an opportunity to the English East India Company to consolidate its power in Bengal and South India. Nor did the Afghans benefit from their viceroy. They could not even hold the Punjab. In fact, the Third Battle of Panipat did not decide who was to rule India but rather who was not. The way was therefore cleared for the rise of the British power in India. The 17-year-old Madhav Rao became the Peshwa in 1761. He was a talented soldier and statesman. Within the short period of 11 years, he restored the lost fortunes of the Maratha Empire. He defeated the Nizam, compelled Hyder Ali of Mysore to pay tribute, and reasserted control over northern India by defeating the Rohillas and subjugating the Rajput states and Jet chiefs. In 1771, the Marathas brought back Emperor Shah Alam to Delhi, who now became their pensioner. Thus, it appeared as if Maratha ascendancy in the north had been recovered. Once again, however, a blow fell on the Marathas, for Madhav Rao died of consumption in 1772. The Maratha Empire was now in a state of confusion. At Pune, there was a struggle for power between Raghunath Rao, the younger brother of Balaji Baji Rao, and Narayan Rao, the younger brother of Madhav Rao. Narayan Rao was killed in 1773. He was succeeded by his posthumous son, Savai Madhav Rao. Out of frustration, Raghunath Rao went over to the British and tried to capture power with their help. They resulted in the First Anglo-Maratha War. The Peshwa's power was now on the wane. At Pune, there was constant intrigue between the supporters of Savai Madhav Rao, headed by Nana Fadnis, and partisans of Raghunath Rao. In the meantime, the big Maratha Sardars had been carving out semi independent states in the north, which could seldom cooperate. Gaikwad at Baroda, Bhonsle at Nagpur, Holkar at Indore, and Scindia at Gwalior were the most important. They had established regular administrations on the pattern of Mughal administration and possessed their separate armies. Their alliance to the Peshwas became more and more nominal. Instead, they joined opposing factions at Pune, intrigued with the armies of Maratha Empire. Among the Maratha rulers in the north, Mahadji Scindia was the most important. He organized a powerful European style army consisting equally of Hindu and Muslim soldiers with the help of French and Portuguese officers and gunners. He established his own ordnance factories near Agra. He established control over Emperor Shah Alam in 1784. From the emperor, he secured the appointment of the Peshwa as the emperor's deputy on the condition that Mahadji would act on behalf of the Peshwa. But he spent his energies intriguing against Nana Fadnis. He was also a bitter enemy of Holkar of Indore. He died in 1794. He and Nana Fadnis, who died in 1800, were the last of the great soldiers and statesmen who had raised the Maratha power to its height in the 18th century. Savai Madhavrao died in 1795 and was succeeded by the utterly worthless Baji Rao II, son of Raghunath Rao. The British had by now decided to put an end to the Maratha challenge to their supremacy in India. The British divided the mutually warring Maratha Sardars through clever diplomacy and then overpowered them in separate battles during the Second Maratha War. 1803 to 1805, and the Third Maratha War 1816 to 19. While other Maratha states were permitted to remain as subsidiary states, the House of Peshwas was extinguished. Thus, the Maratha dream of controlling the Mughal Empire and establishing their own power over large parts of the country could not be realized. This was basically because of the Maratha Empire represented the same decadent social order as the Mughal Empire did and suffered from the same underlying weaknesses. The Maratha chiefs were very similar to the later Mughal nobles, just as the Sananjami system was similar to the Mughal system of Jagirs. So long as there existed a strong central authority and the need for mutual cooperation against a common enemy, the Mughals, they remained united in a loose union. But at first opportunity, they tended to assert their autonomy. If anything, they were even less disciplined than the Mughal nobles. Nor did the Maratha Sardars try to develop a new economy. They failed to encourage science and technology or to take much interest in trade and industry. Their revenue system was similar to that of the Mughals, as also was their administration. Like the Mughals, the Maratha rulers were also mainly interested in raising revenue from the helpless peasantry. For example, they too collected nearly half of the agricultural produce as tax. Unlike the Mughals, they failed even to give sound administration to the people outside Maharashtra. They could not inspire the Indian people with any higher degree of loyalty than the Mughals had succeeded in doing. Their dominion too depended on force and force alone. The only way the Marathas could have stood up to the rising British power was to have transformed their state into a modern state. This they failed to do. Social and economic conditions of the people. India of the 18th century failed to make progress economically, socially, or culturally at an adequate pace. The increasing revenue demands of the state, the oppression of the officials, the greed and rapacity of the nobles, revenue farmers, and zamindars, the marches and counter marches of the rival armies, the depredations of the numerous adventurers roaming the land made the life of the people quite wretched. India of those days was also a land of contrasts. Extreme poverty existed side by side with extreme riches and luxury. On the one hand, there were the rich and powerful nobles steeped in luxury and comfort. On the other, backward, oppressed, and impoverished peasants living at the bare subsistence level and having to bear all sorts of injustice and inequities. Even so, the life of the Indian masses was by and large better at this time than it was after over 100 years of British rule at the end of the 19th century. Indian agriculture during the 18th century was technically backward and stagnant. The techniques of production had remained stationary for centuries. The peasant tried to make up for technical backwardness by working very hard. He, in fact, performed miracles of production. Moreover, he did not usually suffer from shortage of land, but unfortunately, he seldom reaped the fruits of his labor. Even though it was his produce that supported the rest of the society, his own reward was miserably inadequate. The state, the zamindars, the jagirdars, and the revenue farmers tried to extract the maximum amount from him. This was as true of the Mughal state as of the Maratha or Sikh chiefs or other successors of the Mughal state. Even though Indian villages were largely self sufficient and imported little from outside, and the means of communication were backward, extensive trade within the country and between India and other countries of Asia and Europe was carried on under the Mughals. India imported pearls, raw silk, wool, dates, dry fruits, and rosewater from the Persian Gulf, coffee, gold, drugs, and honey from Arabia, tea, sugar, porcelain, and silk from China, gold, musk, and woolen cloth from Tibet, tin from Singapore, spices, perfumes, arak, and sugar from Indonesia islands, ivory and the drugs from Africa, and woolen cloth metals such as copper, iron, and lead, and paper from Europe. India's most important article of export was its cotton textiles, which were famous all over the world for their excellence and were in demand everywhere. India also exported raw silk and silk fabrics, hardware, indigo, saltpeter, opium, rice, wheat, sugar, pepper, and other spices, precious stones, and drugs. Since India was on the whole self sufficient in handicrafts and agricultural products, it did not import foreign goods on a large scale. On the other hand, its industrial and agricultural products had a steady market abroad. Consequently, it exported more than it imported, and its trade was balanced by import of silver and gold. In fact, India was known as a sink of precious metals. Historians differ on the state of internal and foreign trade during the pre colonial period of the 18th century. According to the dominant view, constant warfare, disruption of law and order in many areas during the 18th century harmed the country's internal trade. Many trading centers were looted by the contestants for power and by foreign invaders. Many of the trade routes were infested with organized bands of robbers and traders, and their caravans were regularly looted. Even the road between the two imperial cities, Delhi and Agra, was made unsafe by marauders. Moreover, with the rise of autonomous provincial regimes and innumerable local chiefs, the number of custom houses or chowkis grew up by leaps and bounds. Every petty or large ruler tried to increase his income by imposing heavy customs duties on goods entering or passing through his territories. All these factors had an injurious effect on long distance trade. The impoverishment of the nobles, who were the largest consumers of luxury products in which trade was conducted, also injured internal trade. Other historians believe that the effect of political changes and warfare on internal trade has generally been exaggerated. The impact on foreign trade was also complex and differential. While sea trade expanded, overland trade through Afghanistan and Persia was disrupted. Political factors which hurt trade also adversely affected urban industries. Many prosperous cities, centers of flourishing industry, were sacked and devastated. Delhi was plundered by Nadir Shah, Lahore, Delhi, and Mathura by Ahmad Shah Abdali, Agra by the Jats, Surat and other cities of Gujarat and the Deccan by Maratha chiefs. Sarhind by the Sikhs, and so on. Similarly, in some areas, artisans catering to the needs of the feudal class and the counts suffered as the fortunes of their patrons declined, leading to the decline of cities like Agra and Delhi. The decline of internal and foreign trade also hit them hard in some parts of the country. Nevertheless, some industries in other parts of the country gained as a result of expansion in trade with Europe owing to the activities of the European trading companies. Moreover, the emergence of new courts and local nobility and zamindars led to the emergence of new cities such as Faizabad, Lucknow, Varanasi, and Patna, and the recovery to some extent of production by artisans. Even so, India remained a land of extensive manufacturers. Indian artisans still enjoyed fame all over the world over their skill. India was still a large scale manufacturer of cotton and silk fabrics, sugar, jute, dye-stuffs, mineral and metallic products like arms, metalware, and saltpeter and oils. The important centers of the textile industry were Deccan, Murshidabad in Bengal, Patna in Bihar, Surat, Ahmedabad, and Broch in Gujarat, Chanderi in Madhya Pradesh, Burhanpur in Maharashtra, Jaunpur, Varanasi, Lucknow, and Agra in Uttar Pradesh, Multan and Lahore in the Punjab, Mosilipatnam, Aurangabad, Chikakol, and Vishakhapatnam in Andhra, Bangalore in Karnataka, and Coimbatore and Madurai in Tamil Nadu. Kashmir was a center of woolen manufacturers. Shipbuilding industry flourished in Maharashtra, Andhra, and Bengal. Writing about the great skill of Indians in this respect, an English observer wrote, in shipbuilding, they probably taught the English far more than they learned from them. The European companies bought many Indian made ships for their use. In fact, at the dawn of the 18th century, India was one of the main centers of the world trade and industry. Peter the Great of Russia was led to exclaim, Bear in mind that the commerce of India is the commerce of the world, and he who can exclusively command it is the dictator of Europe. Once again, historians disagree whether there was overall economic decline as a result of the decay of the Mughal Empire and the rise of a large number of autonomous states, or whether trade and agricultural and handicraft production continued to grow in some parts of India while they were disrupted and declined in others, with overall trade and production not suffering any sharp decline. But in fact, the question is not of some progress here and some decline there, but of basic economic stagnation. While the Indian economy was quite resilient and there was a certain continuity in economic life, there was no greater effervescence or buoyancy in economic activities in the 18th century than what was there in the 17th century. On the other hand, there was definitely declining trend. At the same time, it is true that there was less economic distress or decline in agricultural and handicraft production in the Indian states of the 18th century than what was to result from the impact of the British colonialism in the 18th century and 19th centuries. Education. Education was completely neglected in 18th century India, but it was on the whole defective. It was traditional and out of touch with the rapid developments in the West. The knowledge which it imparted was confined to literature, law, religion, philosophy, and logic, and excluded the study of physical and natural sciences, technology, and geography. Nor did it concern itself with a factual and rational study of society. In all fields, original thought was discouraged and reliance placed on ancient learning. The centers of higher education were spread all over the country and were usually financed by Nawabs, Rajas, and rich zamindars. Among the Hindus, higher education was based on Sanskrit learning and was mostly confined to Brahmins, Persian education being based on the official language of the time was equally popular among both Hindus and Muslims. Elementary education was quite widespread. Among the Hindus, it was imparted through town and villages schools, while among the Muslims through the Malvis in maktabs situated in mosques. In these schools, the young students were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Though elementary education was mostly confined to the higher caste like Brahmins, Rajputs, Vaishyas, and many persons from the lower caste also often received it. Interestingly enough, the average literacy was not less than what it was under the British later. Warren Hastings even wrote in 1813 that Indians had in general superior endowments in reading, writing, and arithmetic than the common people of any nation in Europe. Though the standard of primary education was inadequate by modern standards, it suffered for the limited purpose of those days. A very pleasant aspect of education then was that the teachers enjoyed high prestige in the community. A bad feature of it was that girls were seldom given education, to some women of higher classes were an exemption. Social and cultural life. Social life and culture in the 18th century were marked by stagnation and dependence on the past. Despite a certain broad cultural unity that had developed over the centuries, there was no uniformity of culture and social patterns all over the country, nor did all Hindu and all Muslim from two distinct native societies. People were divided by religion, region, tribe, language, and caste. Moreover, the social life and culture of the upper classes, who formed a tiny minority of the total population, was in many respects different from the life and culture of the lower classes. Caste was the central feature of the social life of the Hindus. Apart from the four Varnas, Hindus were divided into numerous castes which differed in their nature from place to place. The caste system rigidly divided people and permanently fixed their place in the social scale. The higher caste, headed by the Brahmins, monopolized all social prestige and privileges. Caste rules were extremely rigid. Intercaste marriages were forbidden. There were restrictions on interdining among members of different castes. In some cases, persons belonging to the higher caste would not take food touched by persons of the lower caste. Caste often determined the choice of profession, though exceptions occurred on a large scale. For example, Brahmins were involved in trade and government service and held zamindaris. Similarly, many Shudras achieved worldly success and wealth and used them to seek higher ritual and caste ranking in society. Similarly, in many parts of the country, caste status had become quite fluid. Caste regulations were strictly enforced by caste councils and panchayats and caste chiefs through fines, penances, and expulsion from the caste. Caste was a major divisive force and element of disintegration in the 18th century India. It often split Hindus living in the same village or region into many social atoms. It was, of course, possible for a person to acquire a higher social status by the acquisition of high office or power, as did the Holkar family in the 18th century. Sometimes, though not often, an entire caste would succeed in raising itself in the caste hierarchy. Muslims were no less divided by considerations of caste, race, tribe, and status. Even though their religion enjoyed social equality on them, the Shia and Sunni nobles were sometimes at loggerheads on account of their religious differences. The Irani, Afghan, Turani, and Hindustani Muslim nobles and officials often stood apart from one another. A large number of Hindus who had converted to Muslim carried their caste into the new religion and observed its distinctions, though not as rigidly as before. Moreover, the Sharif Muslims, consisting of nobles, scholars, priests, and army officers, looked down upon the Ajlaf Muslims or the lower class Muslims in a manner similar to that adopted by the higher caste Hindus towards the lower caste Hindus. The family system in 18th century India was primarily patriarchal, that is, the family was dominated by the senior male member and inheritance was through the male line. In Kerala, however, the family among Nayars was matrilineal. Outside Kerala, women were subjected to nearly complete male control. They were expected to live as mothers and wives only, though in these roles they were shown a great deal of respect and honor. Even during war and anarchy, women were seldom molested and were treated with respect. A European traveler, Abbe J. A. Du Bois, commented at the beginning of the 19th century, a Hindu woman can go anywhere alone, even in the most crowded places, and she need never fear the impertinent looks and jokes of the idle longers. A house inhabited solely by women is a sanctuary which the most shameless libertine would not dream of violating. But the women of the time possessed little individuality of their own. This does not mean that there were no exceptions to this rule. Ahilya Bai administered Indore with great success from 1766 to 1796. Many other Hindu and Muslim ladies played important roles in 18th century politics. While women of the upper classes were not supposed to work outside their homes, peasant women usually worked in the fields, and women of the poorer classes often worked outside their homes to supplement the family income. The purdah was commonly mostly among the higher class in the north. It was not practiced in the south. Boys and girls were not permitted to mix with one another. All marriages were arranged by the heads of the families. Men were permitted to have more than one wife, but except the well off, they normally had only one. On the other hand, a woman was expected to marry only once in her lifetime. The custom of early marriage prevailed all over the country. Sometimes children were married when they were only 3 or 4 years of age. Among the upper classes, the evil customs of incurring heavy expenses on marriages and of giving dowry to the bride prevailed. The evil of dowry was especially widespread in Bengal and Rajputana. In Maharashtra, it was curbed to some extent by energetic steps taken by the Peshwas. Two great social evils of 18th century India, apart from the caste system, were the custom of sati and the condition of the widows. Sati involved the right of a Hindu widow burning herself along with the body of her dead husband. It was mostly prevalent in Rajputana, Bengal, and other parts of northern India. In the south, it was uncommon, and the Marathas did not encourage it. Even in Rajputana and Bengal, it was practiced only by the families of Rajas, chiefs, big zamindars, and upper caste. Widows belonging to the higher classes and higher caste could not remarry, though in some regions and in some castes, for example, among non Brahmins in Maharashtra, the Jats, and people of hill regions of the north, widow remarriage was quite common. The lot of Hindu widow was usually pitiable. There were all sorts of restrictions on her clothing, diet, movements, etc. In general, she was expected to renounce all the pleasures of the world and to serve selflessly the members of her husband's on her brother's family, depending on where she spent the remaining years of her life. Sensitive Indians were often touched by the hard and harsh life of the widows. Raja Savai Jai Singh of Amber and the Maratha general Parshuram Bahu tried to promote widow remarriage but failed. Culturally, India showed some signs of exhaustion during the 18th century, but the 18th century was no dark age. Creativity of the people continued to find expression, cultural continuity with the preceding centuries was maintained, and local traditions continued to evolve. At the same time, culture remained wholly traditionalist. Cultural activities of the time were mostly financed by the royal court, rulers and nobles, chiefs and zamindars, whose impoverishment led to their gradual neglect. The most rapid decline occurred precisely in those branches of the arts which depended on the patronage of kings, princes, and nobles. This was true most of all Mughal architecture and painting. Many of the painters of the Mughal school migrated to provincial courts and flourished at Hyderabad, Lucknow, Kashmir, and Patna. At the same time, new schools of painting were born and achieved distinction. The paintings of the Kangra and Rajputana schools revealed new vitality and taste. In the field of architecture, the Imam Bara of Lucknow reveals proficiency in technique but a decadence in architectural taste. On the other hand, the city of Jaipur and its buildings are an example of continuing vigor. Music continued to develop and flourish in the 18th century, both in the north and the south. Significant progress was made in this field in the reign of Muhammad Shah. Poetry in nearly all the Indian languages tended to lose its touch with life and become decorative, artificial, mechanical, and traditional. Its pessimism reflected the prevailing sense of despair and cynicism, while its content reflected the impoverishment of the spiritual life of its patrons, the feudal nobles and kings. A noteworthy feature of the literary life of the 18th century was the spread of the Urdu language and the vigorous growth of Urdu poetry. Urdu gradually became the medium of social intercourse among the upper classes of northern India, while Urdu poetry shared the weaknesses of contemporary literature in any other Indian languages. It produced brilliant poets like Mir, Sauda, Nazir, and in the 19th century, that great genius Mirza Ghalib. Hindi too was developing throughout the country. Similarly, there was a revival of Malayalam literature, especially under the patronage of the Travancore rulers Martanda Varma and Rama Varma. One of the great poets of Kerala, Kunchan Nambayar, who wrote popular poetry in the language of daily usage, lived at this time. 18th century Kerala also witnessed the full development of Kathakali literature, drama, and dance. The Padmanabhapuram Palace, with its remarkable architecture and mural paintings, was also constructed in the 18th century. Tayumanvar was one of the best exponents of Sittar poetry in Tamil. In line with other Sittar poets, he protested against the abuses of temple rule and the caste system. Music, poetry, and dance flourished under the patronage of the Tanjore court in the first half of the 18th century. In Assam, literature developed under the patronage of the Ahom kings. Dayaram, one of the great lyricists of Gujarat, wrote during the second half of the 18th century. Heer Ranjha, the famous romantic epic in Punjabi, was composed at this time by Waris Shah. For Sindhi literature, the 18th century was a period of enormous achievement. Shah Abdul Latif composed his famous collection of poems, Risalo. Sachal and Sami were the other great Sindhi poets of this century. The main weakness of Indian culture lay in the field of science. Throughout the 18th century, India remained far behind the West in science and technology. For the last 200 years, Western Europe had been undergoing a scientific and economic revolution that was leading to a spate of inventions and discoveries. The scientific outlook was gradually pervading the Western mind and revolutionizing the philosophical, political, and economic outlook of the Europeans and their institutions. On the other hand, the Indians, who had in earlier ages made vital contributions to the field of mathematics and natural sciences, had been neglecting the sciences for several centuries. Indian mind was still tied to tradition. Both the nobles and the common people were superstitious to a high degree. The Indians remained almost wholly ignorant of scientific, cultural, political, and economic achievements of the West. They failed to respond to the European challenge. The 18th century Indian rulers showed little interest in things Western except in their weapons of war and techniques of military training. Except Tipu, they were content with the ideological apparatus they had inherited from the Mughals and other 16th and 17th century rulers. There were, of course, some intellectual stirrings. No people or culture can be totally stagnant. Some changes and advances in technology were being made, but their pace was very slow and their scope severely limited, so that on the whole they were negligible compared to the advances in Western Europe. This weakness in the realms of science was to a large extent responsible for the total subjugation of India by the most advanced country of the time. The struggle for power and wealth, economic decline, social backwardness, and cultural stagnation had a deep and harmful impact on the morals of a section of the Indian people. The nobles, in particular, degenerated in their private and public life. The virtues of loyalty, gratitude, and faithfulness to their pledged word tended to disappear in the single minded pursuit of selfish aims. Many of the nobles fell prey to degrading vices and excessive luxury. Most of them took bribes when in office. Surprisingly enough, the common people were not debased to any marked extent. They continue to exhibit a high degree of personal integrity and morality. For example, the well known British official John Malcolm remarked in 1821, "I don't know the example of any great population in similar circumstances preserving through such a period of changes and tyrannical rule so much virtue and so many qualities as are to be found in a great proportion of the inhabitants of this country." In particular, he praised the absence of the common vices of theft, drunkenness, and violence. Similarly, Cranford, another European writer, observed, "Their rules of morality are most benevolent, and hospitality and charity are not only strongly inculcated, but I believe now here more universally practiced than amongst Hindus." Friendly relations between the Hindus and Muslims were a very healthy feature of life in 18th century India. Even though the nobles and chiefs of the time fought one another incessantly, their fights and their alliances were seldom based on distinctions of religion. In other words, their politics were essentially secular. In fact, there was a little communal bitterness or religious intolerance in the country. All people, high or low, respected one another's religion and a spirit of tolerance, even harmony, prevailed. The mutual relations of Hindus and Muslims were those of brothers among brothers. This was particularly true of the common people in the villages and towns who fully shared one another's joys and sorrows irrespective of their religious affiliations. The Hindus and the Muslims cooperated in non religious spheres such as social life and cultural affairs. The evolution of composite Hindu Muslim culture or of common ways and attitudes continued unimpeded. Hindu writers often wrote in Persian while Muslim writers wrote in Hindi, Bengali, and other vernaculars, often dealing with subjects of Hindu social life and religion, such as Radha and Krishna, Sita and Ram, and Nal and Damayanti. The development of Urdu language and literature provided a new meeting ground between Hindus and Muslims. Even in the religious sphere, the mutual influence and respect that had been developing in the last few centuries as a result of the spread of the Bhakti movement among Hindus and Sufism among Muslims continued to grow. A large number of Hindus worshipped Muslim saints, and many Muslims showed equal veneration for Hindu gods and saints. Many local cults and shrines had both Hindu and Muslim followers. Muslim rulers, nobles, and commoners joyfully joined in the Hindu festivals such as Holi, Diwali, and Durga Puja, just as Hindus participated in the Muharram processions, and Hindu officials and zamindars presided at other Muslim festivals. The Marathas supported the shrine of Sheikh Muniuddin Chishti in Ajmer, and the Raja of Tanjore supported the shrine of Sheikh Shahul Hamid of Nagaur. We have already seen how Tipu gave financial support to the Sringeri temple as also to other temples. It is noteworthy that Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the greatest Indian of the first half of the 19th century, was influenced in an equal measure by the Hindu and Islamic philosophical and religious systems. It may also be noted that religious affiliation was not the main point of departure in cultural and social life. The ways of life of upper class Hindus and Muslims converged much more than the ways of life of upper class and lower class Hindus or of upper class and lower class Muslims. Similarly, regions or areas provided points of departure. People of one region had far greater cultural synthesis irrespective of religion than people following the same religion spread over different regions. People living in the villages also tended to have a different pattern of social and cultural life than that of the town dwellers. Thanks for watching this video, and please do like, share and subscribe to our channel Reading by Me.